This is Unfuck the Poor. I'm Joe Love, and we're talking about the unsaved reprobate Dr. Peter S. Ruckman. Our New Year's goal is to get a dozen new listeners. We've got 12. We'd like 12 more. Give us 5 stars and tell your friends. So far, Ruckman is not a saved Christian. He's actually a Zen Buddhist, and he has just attained enlightenment at the Japanese Yuraku Hotel. He is still getting drunk every day, starting fights, and hiring prostitutes. In February 1947, Ruckman finally gets his shit together and leaves Japan to be with his family. On the ship, the General Morgan, Ruckman once again gets into a complicated relationship, this time to a Korean woman named Helena Soon Kim, and once again bullshits his way into convincing a woman to move to the States with him. The General Morgan docks in Hawaii, and Helena and Ruckman take leave in the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. Ruckman says, quote, "shacked up with my concubine," end quote. When they return to the General Morgan, Ruckman is the first man back and is put in charge of checking the returning soldiers for liquor. Ruckman doesn't give a shit, so he lets all the soldiers come aboard with booze, and all hell breaks loose. Quote, "Everything came completely to pieces. The fights that started down on B and C decks quickly progressed from fists to bed slats, Darwin's evolution, and from there to 45 caliber bullets ricocheting off the metal sides of the ship, more evolution. Drunks who had passed out blocked exits and companionways. Warrant officers were chasing Red Cross nurses all over the ship. A couple of SPs were too drunk to know what was going on," end quote. Eventually, finally, Ruckman returns to Alabama, though not before cheating on his wife a few more times. Ruckman gets a radio job, loses it, gets a shipbuilding job, then finds an opening in Pensacola at WEAR. There he gets some recognition as a DJ and gets a better job at WABB in Mobile, Alabama. Finally settled down, now 27-year-old Ruckman still drinks, but he has a good job, plays guitar for his wife, and paints. But he can't get back to the feeling of peace and enlightenment that he felt in the Yakura Hotel. One night, nearing Christmas, Ruckman is wandering the streets drunk, and he forces his way into a priest's home and demands to know what God has to say. Now, for the story of Ruckman's deliverance unto the Lord, Ruckman really needs you to believe all the crazy shit that's about to happen to him. All of it far-fetched. Ruckman's story from here on out will be a holy man telling you how a wretched man was saved. And if the depiction of the wretched man was accurate, it's entirely possible that he's just bullshitting us because, he's a lying piece of shit. Ruckman barges into the priest's home and demands to know what God has to say, and the priest reads to him Isaiah 55, verse 7. Quote, "Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return unto the Lord, and he will have mercy upon him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon." End quote. Moved by this, Ruckman confesses to Janie that he's cheated on her profusely while in the military. He says that he wants to find a job in Pensacola, and that when he does, he'll send for Janie and Diana. Obviously, Ruckman wants out of the marriage, but in the 1940s, that's not so easy. Ruckman goes to Pensacola anyway without Janie and Diana and starts drinking and fucking around again. One night, drunk, Ruckman is closing his tab at a bar and hears a voice call out to him, "You need to get a Bible." Ruckman doesn't see anyone talking to him, so he counts his money, then hears the voice again, "You need to get a Bible." Ruckman hears the voice a third time as he's walking outside, and finally Ruckman says, "Okay, fine, I'll get a Bible." And he does. It's 11 o'clock at night, Ruckman is walking home and everything is closed, so as Ruckman is walking by a boarding house, he happens to spot a coverless King James Bible, quote, lying at the bottom of a bed, half hidden by a pile of old newspapers. I don't think this happened, but he says it did. So Ruckman, being Ruckman, breaks into the boarding house and steals the Bible, whose owner is passed out in the bed. Again, I don't think this happened. Ruckman takes the book home, sits on the bed, and says, quote, "Now, if this book is more than any other kind of book, wherever I open it will speak to me personally." Ruckman opens the Bible and points his finger at a random verse, Ezekiel 28, verses 2-3. Quote, "Thou art a man, thou art not a God." He recoils, "The horror!" And Ruckman points to a new verse, Deuteronomy 28, verses 20-24. Quote, "The Lord will send on you curses, confusion, and rebuke you in everything you put your hand to, until you are destroyed and come to sudden ruin because of the evil you have done in forsaking him." End quote. Ruckman then describes a 4-week battle between himself and God. For these 4 weeks, Ruckman will do the same bit over and over, opening the Bible and finding a verse that makes him recoil in horror. Ruckman pleads with the Bible, quote, "Tell me something good about myself." But Ruckman never lands on any of the good verses. Quote, The Lord shall smite thee with madness and blindness. I will make thy grave, for thou art vile, and thy life shall hang in doubt before thee. Ruckman loses his shit again, once again breaking into the parish house and harassing the priest. Quote, "You got anything real, father?" Rather than being horrified that Ruckman keeps breaking into his house, the priest tells Ruckman to join the church. And Ruckman goes all in. He takes convert courses from a Jesuit priest, Father Sullivan, goes to Mass at St. Michael's, makes the sign of the cross, gets the ashes on his forehead on Ash Wednesday, he's giving to the poor, tithing, he's doing everything he's supposed to do in church. Still, he hates the Bible because every time he opens it up, it's mean to him. He opens it to Revelation 3, quote, "You knowest not that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked." Ruckman thinks this is hilarious. He's not blind. According to Ruckman, he breaks his glasses the next morning. 2 days later, he fixes his glasses. He still thinks it's hilarious. He's not naked. The next day at the radio station, one of his suits goes missing from the coat rack. He never finds his suit, but still he thinks it's funny. He's not broke. The next night, while playing in his band in Pensacola, he loses his wallet with 3 weeks' pay in it. Every time Ruckman opens the Bible, quote, "Behold, ye are nothing." Ruckman wakes up one Sunday evening from an all-night binge, missing church, and finds that he has pustules all over his face. Quote, "I shall smite thee from the crown of thy head to the sole of thy feet with sores and blemishes." End quote. In a panic, Ruckman prays to God, who tells him he's going to hell unless he finds Christ right then. Ruckman rushes out into the street, hungover, and proceeds to have a conversation with the cartoon devil and angel on his shoulders while standing outside the Missionary Alliance Church. He describes this as a dialogue between good and evil, one voice telling him to go in the church and pray, and the other telling him to go on by the church and enjoy his sinful life. Ruckman goes home and sleeps. The next morning, Monday, rushing off to work, Ruckman says he hears church bells and a loud choir singing. It's weird because there shouldn't be church bells at 5 in the morning, but he doesn't think much about it. The story of Ruckman's salvation and education comes next, and it intertwines with the failure of his marriage to Janie May, as well as the addition of 4 more children. Having admitted that he's been hearing voices and church bells, Ruckman continues about his life like everything is okay, except for this strange battle he's having with God in his head. At the radio station the same morning, he hears church bells. He sets his sights on the radio preacher Hugh Pyle, thinking he can get a rise out of him. Ruckman has this tendency that never goes away his whole life to size up other men and think he can railroad them. He calls Bob Jones Jr. a sissy in his autobiography, which, sure, he probably was. Anyway, Ruckman gets smart with Pyle, and Pyle returns the favor. Ruckman says, "Hi, preacher, what do you know?" And Pyle replies, quote, "I know the Lord Jesus Christ. What do you know?" And this is now officially my new reply for when I don't want to get in a conversation. Pyle introduces Ruckman to the King James 1611 authorized version. That's important, and gives Ruckman a run for his money. Pyle asks Ruckman if he's willing to let God save him, and Ruckman calls his bluff. So, in the WEAR radio station, Pyle prays over Ruckman and tells him he's saved. Then, he asks Ruckman if he believes it, and Ruckman fucks up. He says he doesn't know. Now, the reason it seems like Baptist preachers can think so quickly on their feet is that normal people aren't unique. We say the same thing all the time, and Baptist preachers have heard it all. So, when he asks Ruckman if he believes he's been saved and Ruckman says he isn't sure, Pyle tears Ruckman a new asshole. Quote, "You don't think God is a liar, do you?" And for the first time in his life, Ruckman is bested. He sheepishly tells Pyle that God isn't a liar. And then Pyle tells Ruckman to reconcile with his wife, Janie. Ruckman is still living in a Pensacola flophouse while working at the radio station and taking convert lessons. Ruckman is still living in a Pensacola flophouse while working at the radio station and taking convert lessons from Father Sullivan at St. Michael's. Ruckman is smart, and having taken a lesson from Hugh Pyle, Ruckman realizes there is power in holding religious men to the Bible. A lot of power. He gets into a shouting match with Father Sullivan during one of their final classes on interpreting passages from the Bible. Ruckman is basically pulling passages out of the Bible and grilling the priest on them, and Father Sullivan tells Ruckman he's reading too much into the Bible and needs to read something else. But Ruckman keeps going to St. Michael's, and after the last service he attends, he and Father Sullivan are smoking cigars, and Father Sullivan shares a rather mundane observation about New Orleans, that the people in the French Quarter, though immoral, have kept the old faith. Ruckman's brain cannot comprehend this. He recalls his time as a 17-year-old spent in New Orleans smoking weed, drinking, playing in bands, selling art. Quote, "For the red light from the neon sign on Rhodes Furniture Company illuminated the smoke. It filtered up past the priest's eyes in red strands that wavered like snakes. And the voice in his head said, 'Do you see that, Pete? That's not a priest. It's a demon.'" End quote. So Ruckman doesn't become a Catholic. Instead, Ruckman goes to Hugh Pyle's church that evening, which he calls a true Bible-believing Baptist church, and listening to the sermon, words about eternal life and joy and service, Ruckman finds meaning and clarity. Quote, "It was appearing that his liberal upbringing and his avant-garde activities, plus his liberal college education and more than liberated lifestyle, had actually made a narrow-minded bigot out of him." End quote. Ruckman becomes a Baptist in 1949. And that summer, Ruckman goes back to Sawyerville, Alabama, to be with his wife, Janie. Hugh Pyle, the radio preacher who saved Ruckman at the radio station, intervenes in Ruckman's marriage and offers Peter and Janie counseling. Baptist counseling is just praying and crying. Janie isn't into it. Janie's problem is that Ruckman is still an asshole. And remember that Janie's family is very religious. Janie is religious. She's the one who doesn't go to the movies, she doesn't drink, she doesn't smoke. And she was faithful to her husband while he was in the military. And while Ruckman admits he wasn't a perfect husband, the way he writes about Janie during this time period suggests he resents her. He resents that she grew up knowing she was saved, that she didn't struggle with sin the way he did. Janie is hurt, and rightly so, by Ruckman's cheating past. She says she forgives him, but that shit is really hard to forgive and forget. It's unclear exactly what Ruckman confessed to Janie, whether he ever admitted that he just married her so that he could sleep with her, but without a doubt, he told her about cheating on her so many times. Janie is understandably jealous and defensive, and Ruckman is unsurprisingly dense. They try to attend church together, but Ruckman tells Janie that she should sing in the choir like the girl who was singing solo. Quote, "Janie came apart, and I saw at once the damage I had done between 1944 and 1949 would probably never be repaired. She was now jealous and suspicious of any move that I made in any direction." End quote. That sounds about right. She accused him of looking down women's dresses when they came to the altar. Again, sounds about right. They are baptized together in the creek at Dixon Mills, Alabama by Pastor Roy Kemp. But even this, Ruckman fucks up. Ruckman wants to go first, so instead of being baptized with his wife, they do it in sequence. Ruckman first, then Janie. Janie wants to know why he didn't wait for her, and Ruckman doesn't have a response other than he felt he really needed to be baptized as soon as possible. The summer of 1949 is important for Ruckman. He gets baptized, he's back in Alabama with his wife trying to work shit out, and he decides he needs to save his parents who are vacationing at his aunt's cottage in Rehoboth Beach. Ruckman, Janie, and Janie's brother Bubba drive up to Delaware, where for 3 days, Ruckman tries to get his already Episcopalian parents to accept Jesus Christ. Ruckman starts by begging them for forgiveness on his knees in the living room. He does this in front of his wife and brother-in-law, and then says he doesn't want them to go to hell. Ruckman's mother and father politely decline, which makes Ruckman cry. Colonel Ruckman says to his son, quote, "Well, son, don't take it so hard. We can go see a doctor in the morning. Johnny has a good psychiatrist up in Dover." End quote. Everyone can see that Ruckman is not well. His parents try to get their guests to enjoy their time at the beach. But Ruckman hauls ass back to Alabama. A few months later, September 1949, Ruckman enrolls at Bob Jones University to get his master's degree in radio arts. This time, he doesn't leave his family behind. Ruckman buys a used 40-foot trailer with no bathroom, no hot water, and no refrigerator, and the family lives in a trailer park while he goes to school. I'm not going to go into every single thing that happens during Ruckman's time at Bob Jones University. I'll sum it up in a bit, but we do need to talk about his marriage to Janie and his family. Ruckman is aggressive with his wife. Not just grabbing and shoving, but by his own admission, he hits Janie several times in their marriage. He claims he doesn't hit her after he becomes saved, but Janie does wind up with bruises, which Ruckman blames on her sensitive skin. They continue to have children together. They'll wind up with 5 total, and even this is contentious. Ruckman doesn't want to name a boy after himself. He doesn't want a junior, but Janie does. In 1959, Janie and Ruckman will have their 5th and final child, a boy, and Ruckman relents and agrees to name the boy after himself, Peter S. Ruckman Jr. This is a complete tangent, but Peter S. Ruckman Jr. would come to be known as, quote, the evil by his ex-wife. Ruckman Jr. murdered his 2 sons, then committed suicide in 2018. In the same way that Ruckman never mentions his sister and barely mentions his brother, Ruckman rarely mentions his children from any of his 3 marriages. They are basically just non-people in his life. Now, he does mention them and he does include some photos of them in his book, but by and large, his autobiography has really nothing to do with being a father and more or less being a fuck-up as a young man and then becoming saved as an adult and then his ministry. And this does fit with what Ruckman calls his inability to see people for who they are, actual people. But this also fits with narcissistic personality disorder. Ruckman will go on to write a lot of books and give thousands of sermons, and the whole time, because he's a preacher, the pretense is that God is the focus. Faith and service are the whole reason for picking up the Bible. But as you get to studying Ruckman, it becomes clear that Ruckman really only thinks about himself. He's intensely focused on his numbers, how many books he's read, movies he's seen, illustrations he's done, and how many souls he's saved. Ruckman does not get along with people who disagree with him, so much so that his specific interpretation of the Bible will be named after him, and his followers will take up his name. Back to Ruckman's shitty first marriage. Janie and Peter are living in the shitty trailer and fighting. Although made new in Christ, Ruckman is still an asshole, and Janie is still hurt by the cheating. Quote, "The subject of my past infidelities would surface time and again, every time, in fact, that an argument came up about anything. And there was nothing about Janie's situation that helped matters. She was pregnant with my first son, David Ferrier, and living in the small plywood trailer with no transportation, very few friends, and a diet that would hardly keep a sharecropper alive. She had little to live for. The gap between us widened with the passing of the months. I would tell her, 'Don't bring it up. Don't kindle these fires again. You'll get burnt.'" End quote. Ruckman is also paranoid about Janie's behavior. While at Bob Jones University, eventually Ruckman strikes up a friendship with Bob Jones Sr., though they don't get along at first. Quote, "When I really got down in the mouth, sometimes the offerings were practically nothing or I was sick through the whole meeting, Janie would go to Dr. Bob Sr. and talk with him personally. She did this not because she was burdened, but because she sensed that the comradeship between me and the old man was very, very close. She wanted to insert herself between us. She did this with more than one Christian, male or female, that got into the inner circle. When she got with old man Bob, she sold herself, not her husband." End quote. Eventually, Ruckman will graduate with a PhD from Bob Jones University, though the way Ruckman explains his time at Bob Jones, it sounds like getting out of there was an act of God. First off, Ruckman does not get along with Bob Jones Jr. Quote, "Jones Jr. was what we call a hothouse intellectual, a sort of pseudo-artist like Truman Capote or Andy Warhol. He had no personal experience with art or music and no experience with life. He was an excellent actor, but that was about the limit of his talent. His writing was mediocre. He couldn't play one single musical instrument, and he couldn't draw flies or paint a barn." End quote. And Ruckman continued to get into arguments with his teachers and mentors. His PhD thesis was criticized for not using enough sources, and Ruckman's response was to criticize his professor's dissertation. Ruckman accuses the teachers of tanking his grades because they didn't like his style, having to change other students' grades, and delaying his graduation a year. Ruckman despised the educated men who deigned to teach him the word of the Lord, calling them backslidden humanists and accusing them of having never won any souls. During his time at Bob Jones University, in addition to his shitty marriage and his studies, Ruckman becomes an actual evangelist, traveling to churches and preaching in his unique style that he learned in high school. Ruckman's chalk talks are fascinating to watch, as is Ruckman's ability to keep a train of thought on his sermon, seemingly speaking off the top of his head while he makes a series of strokes on a large canvas or paper behind him. The pictures reveal themselves just like his sermons. He's drawing the entire time that he's preaching, and it's easy to see why worshipers were drawn to Ruckman. He is magnetic. You can't stop watching or listening no matter how fucking crazy he sounds. And while Ruckman is in the South, he starts to identify as a Southerner. He goes through this whole ass thing in his autobiography about how he starts talking with a Southern accent and starts preferring Southern food, but then throws in this bit, quote, "I began to see why Southerners believed in separate but equal facilities. I learned about the blacks by being where they were and dealing with them. I preached in black churches. I found out something. Black folks are not like white folks." End quote. This is a pretty important part of Ruckman's ministry that we'll get into in a little bit. Ruckman is ordained on the day he graduates from Bob Jones University, and it's fucking weird. A car pulls up to him, calls him over, and the superintendent of the Evansville Rescue Mission, Ernest Reveal, puts his hand out the car window and prays over Ruckman and ordains him in the street. Already a seasoned street and church evangelist, Ruckman is now a PhD-holding, street-ordained Baptist minister, and for the next 10 or so years, Ruckman will go on to hold countless revival services as a traveling preacher. Key West, Chicago, Nova Scotia, Los Angeles. Ruckman is so popular, a group of parish members pool their money to purchase Ruckman a 3-bed, 2-bath home on a half-acre of land in Bay Minette. Ruckman moves Janie and the kids out of the trailer and into the new home and continues to travel and preach. Still, Janie is not a happy wife. She did not marry a traveling preacher. She married an artist, a musician. She now has 5 kids with a man who is unfaithful to her, a man who has hit her, who threatens her, who has spent the majority of their relationship away, apparently breaking into priests' homes, sleeping in flop houses while playing the drums. Broken promises, lies, and erratic behavior. She has watched her husband cry on the floor about trying to keep his parents from going to hell. She has watched him unravel and change careers. Nothing about Ruckman really has changed. Instead of working at a radio station in another city, now Ruckman is on the road where he keeps his salvation count high. 1,000 saved, 1,200, 2,000. Ruckman can grow a ministry, but he can't maintain a relationship. Janie feels abandoned, and she spirals into depression. She asks Peter to leave the ministry. Then she threatens to kill herself if Peter doesn't stay home and be more involved in family life. Then she attempts suicide. She slashes her wrists. She tries to jump out of their car while on the highway. Ruckman doesn't take this behavior seriously. He dismisses it as essentially showing out in his autobiography, but obviously Janie is distraught. In 1958, Ruckman has performed over 2,000 of his chalk talks and has offered a television ministry, which puts him on the path to becoming the man he had looked up to when he was going through college courses at Bob Jones, Billy Graham. Ruckman had watched Graham preach at Bob Jones from a lighting cage over the auditorium and was enthralled by the numbers of people who came forward to be saved and to affirm their faith. Though Ruckman would later have it out for Graham, the younger Ruckman wanted to be in the spotlight. He wanted the television gig. After their 5th child is born, Peter Jr., Janie takes to a wheelchair. Ruckman says she faked paralysis, and whether it was genuine or not, it did have the effect of keeping Ruckman at home. Ruckman cancels his traveling plans, and the television ministry doesn't work out. They move off the half-acre at Janie's request. Likely, the cost of keeping the house meant that Ruckman worked more, meaning he traveled more. She thought moving to a smaller home with smaller bills would keep Ruckman around. Ruckman takes a job preaching in Bay Minette, no longer an evangelist, now just a regular old preacher. By 1961, Janie has had enough of Ruckman's bullshit and decides to leave. She tells her doctor that Ruckman has been beating her and that she wants to leave him. When the doctor asks for proof, Janie produces bruises on her wrists and body. Ruckman says, quote, "She got a violent argument going where I grabbed her by the wrists without hitting her and shoved her up against a table without hitting her and a sink without hitting her. She showed these bruises to a doctor. Her skin was always ultra-sensitive after our 3rd child, and it didn't take much more than a touch to leave a mark." End quote. So he beat his wife. Janie calls Ruckman's parents and tells them that Peter is turning into Johnny, Ruckman's older brother by 1 year. Peter tells the brief story of his brother, how his behavior and attitude changed after a summer at Camp Mishawaka, an Episcopalian summer camp. When Johnny graduated high school, he was accepted at West Point but opted not to go. He wanted to be an actor and went to the University of Kansas, but he was drafted in the war and served in England. He was discharged as mentally unfit and diagnosed with what would later be known as schizophrenia. He was completely disabled and spent the rest of his life in mental hospitals. Janie called Hugh Pyle, the radio preacher who had tried to reconcile their marriage, and lets him know that Ruckman is a danger to her and the children and that she is going to leave. And Janie does leave. One morning, Janie packs up the car, loads up the 5 children, and drives home to Sawyerville, Alabama to stay with her family. Ruckman is upset that Janie has taken the car. He's upset that the house is empty and he now has 2 dogs to take care of. He doesn't miss Janie, but he says he misses the children. Ruckman tries to get his friends to intervene. He tries to get Bob Jones Sr. to intervene, but Bob Jones Sr. refuses. He says he doesn't want the scandal to touch his university. Eventually, Janie does write back. She says that she will come back if Ruckman sees a psychiatrist. He sees 3, and because narcissists are good at pretending to be normal, they conclude Ruckman is fine. Janie says she'll come back if he quits the ministry, if he gets a vasectomy. To his credit, apparently he does these things, though he will go on to have 5 more children, so I think he's a liar. But Janie isn't convinced. Janie files for divorce in 1962, Ruckman contests it, and the divorce goes to trial. Ruckman gives an account of the trial that makes it sound like the court was on his side. However, there is a court record. Janie filed for divorce on grounds of cruelty and abandonment. Ruckman then filed a cross-complaint for abandonment. Ultimately, the court agreed with Peter Ruckman that Janie had abandoned him. The problem with Janie's side of the case, I believe, was the absence of testimony from Janie's doctor, Dr. McAdory, who submitted a witness statement instead of appearing as a witness. As a result of that, the court ruled, quote, Dr. McAdory's testimony was based upon statements made to him by the complainant and is therefore dependent upon the complainant's testimony, end quote. However, the court awarded Janie full custody and $125 per month in child support. Ruckman got the child for 2 months in the summer and a week at Christmas. Ruckman has to sell his house and the land and split the proceeds with Janie. Court records indicate that around this time, Ruckman was making about $6,500 a year. That's about $65,000 in today's dollars. Janie appeals to the Supreme Court of Alabama, and the ruling holds. At the end of the Supreme Court trial, the judge calls the two Ruckmans to the bench and asks if they each take responsibility for the marriage's failure. Peter Ruckman says absolutely. Janie Ruckman says not no, but hell no. And then they were divorced. After the divorce, Ruckman starts the Pensacola Bible Institute. He completes a road trip ministry with his 5 children, and he is finally on the path that God has chosen for him. Janie doesn't do great from here. By 1968, Janie will lose custody of all 5 children. She lives alone in an apartment with little money. Ruckman finally says of his marriage, quote, there were none of those things in a marriage that women look for from their husbands in the way of little endearments, compliments, special gifts, personal intimacies, etc. The marriage had started wrong, it had to end wrong, and it did, end quote. 10 years later, 1972, Ruckman will marry Sherry Rubin, and their marriage will last as long as his first, 16 years. Like Janie, Sherry also didn't want to be a preacher's wife, and Sherry tried to commit suicide with sleeping pills just 2 years into their marriage. Ruckman speaks of his marriage to Sherry in much the same way as his marriage to Janie. Ruckman tries to do things right, but he has a wife who only complains. This is a pattern that Ruckman will repeat in every relationship in his life. If someone doesn't treat Peter S. Ruckman like he's the man in charge, there's something wrong with them. Whether it's personal relationships or professional, Ruckman's personality does not tolerate dissent. This, too, will play heavily into his ministry. Of his ex-wife Sherry, Ruckman says, quote, every one of her needs was supplied, and she had the privilege of being in one of the most evangelistic and biblical works in the United States. She could pick her friends from that group. Almost every married woman she got near got a divorce. I counted 4 of them in 10 years. Her real comforter, guide, counselor, and the partner for the whole time was not God, it was her sister. I found out quickly that my wife had no prayer life at all, and she didn't read the Bible through 1 time in a year. But I loved her, so I covered up for her, and I loved God, so I tried to make it work. End quote. In the same way that Ruckman resented Janie for never forgiving him, he resents his wife Sherry for not sharing the same zeal of faith. They divorced in 1988. In 1989, Peter marries Pamela Huggins. Ruckman says Huggins fits the bill of the idealized wife he gleaned from Proverbs chapter 3. In this story, King Lemuel recalls the proverb told to him by his mother about the woman he will marry. And I don't want to read you the whole thing, but imagine a handbook for a trad wife relationship, and you have the idea. She gets up early and feeds the children and her husband. She speaks kind words. She makes her own clothes and does good work. Quote, she will do him good and not evil for all the days of her life, end quote. Ruckman has been searching for a submissive woman who won't challenge him, who knows her place with Ruckman because that place, according to God, is beneath him. Throughout Ruckman's autobiography, he ages himself by putting his personal story in context with global events. He is at once documenting his personal story. He shares stories of friends and family who pass away, and he knows they are going to hell, and he feels his own clock ticking. If anyone deserves hell, Ruckman thinks it's certainly him. But Ruckman is also documenting the decline of Christian values the world over and the rise of Satanism or the Antichrist. His realization upon watching the smoke from Father Sullivan's cigar light up red in the neon sign, remember he called the priest a demon, has set in Ruckman's mind the idea that Catholics are the Antichrist. Ruckman does not see world history as a rolling sea of events that play on one another. He does not see geopolitics as a complicated game of diverging and colliding interests. All of it, from the deaths of his family, the deaths of celebrities, to the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the moon landing in the 1974 earthquake in Pakistan, as a testament to the approaching end times. He sees all events connected to the words of the King James Bible, which, when read in modern times, is as much prophecy as testament. Ruckman frames all these events against the number of souls he has saved and the number of souls he wants to save. Ruckman, for his part, at one time wanting to be the next Billy Graham, believes it is the will of God to save the entire world if only they would listen. And this is where all the chalk drawings, evangelism, and neurotic internal monologue becomes the gospel of Peter S. Ruckman, or Ruckmanism. His followers, Ruckmanites, will not only be saved through Jesus, but they will be saved through Ruckman's interpretation of the King James Bible. But Ruckman is an asshole, a paranoid asshole, and a racist. He is a paranoid, racist asshole. And Ruckmanism is also exactly that. It provides a religious justification for the segregation of races and the hatred of homosexuals. We'll get into the hate part of Ruckmanism in the next episode. That's it for today. Give us 5 stars, leave us a comment, follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. Tell your friends you heard it on Unfuck the Poor.